In many ways, the fate of our nation right now.
7 meters 30.
Well, it's taken a lot of people to get to this point, a lot of generations.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Sophie. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great too. I actually just finished listening to your interview with Anne O'Brien. And I think I have a pretty good idea, but can you tell me why you wanted to speak with her?
I was at the Winter Olympics quite recently in Milano as a spectator, and it was fantastic. Being at those big sporting events, it's also very interesting to understand how women are being portrayed and covered. If you looked more closely at the media coverage of it, there's some subtle and some not so subtle changes and differences when women were covered and when male athletes were covered. It always strikes me as odd that there's still this sort of imbalance of how women coverage might differ to men's coverage. And so I stumbled upon this report that Anne O'Brien, who's an associate professor in Ireland, did on media coverage in Ireland. And I want to talk to her about her research and her findings and what she thought was kind of the essence of achieving gender equality in media coverage as well.
There was one thing that I think next time I have a sports paper on my hands, I will try to do.
The horses.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that without spoiling it too much?
So Anne O'Brien spoke with, several journalists to understand, how they go about covering female sport and also some limitations in their own newsrooms or what they perceived as maybe an obstacle to covering more women. But then she spoke with one journalist. They were speaking, I guess, about the knowledge gap or audience gap, so that sometimes they don't know as much about female sport, and that kind of hinders them from reporting more on women in sport. That there also sometimes isn't in their perception an audience for it. And then, that journalist said, well, wait a minute, we also cover horse races a lot, and they don't gather a large audience in a big stadium like rugby games do either. And then she kind of made a habit of kind of checking out newspapers and seeing if there was more from horses or female athletes. And I guess the answer is in the interview, and you have to listen to it yourself.
Yeah. Definitely listen for the answer.
But other than that, I think it's very important that we also kind of look at the research done around women in sport. And that's why I was very glad to talk to Anne and find out more about, in that case, interviews with journalists that were done and to understand the landscape in Ireland and to some extent also draw some conclusions about what that means for other countries.
Do you think she was optimistic about how the evolution of the coverage for women's sports have been?
I think she was also very empathetic to, journalists and why sometimes coverage isn't equal. But I think she was very determined to find out more about the baseline and why things are the way they are. And I think we are all optimistic in a way, just by talking about the topic, trying to increase coverage and getting those great stories of women in sport out there. Well, let's get to it. Today, we want to talk about media representation of women in sport, what research has shown us about mis- and underrepresentation, and why it matters how we portray women. I'm joined by Anne O'Brien. Anne is an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University in Ireland, and she has published a range of books and articles on gender and media industries. Thanks so much for joining us today, Anne.
Great to be here, Sophie. Looking forward to our conversation.
I looked at your publications, which are, of course, about the film and media industry, and I want to delve into that a bit later because I wonder to what extent that is also representative of what you found in sports. But I want to go one step back and ask you, how did sport become a research subject for you? Because it kind of stuck out for me as I went through and over your publications.
It was Actually, through the work that I had done on women in media work, it was actually the head of sport in RTE, which is Rádeo Telefís Éireann, the Irish public service broadcaster. The deputy head of sport at that time is a woman called Cliona O'Leary, and she came across my book, Women, Inequality in Media Work, in early 2020, I think it was just published, and she was very interested in it. She had herself been advocating a lot for women within the sports department, and she had sort of had a moment herself of recognizing the huge gender inequalities that were going on in terms of what the sports department in RT were themselves producing. And she was very curious to know what research had been done, particularly in an Irish context, really to try to get a baseline for, well, how much coverage do women get in media? And what we quite quickly realized was that kind of baseline research didn't really exist. And so we set about doing a little piece of monitoring to get a feel for kind of how much airtime were women getting, and started looking around to see internationally what was published on this and what was going on. So that was really how I got co-opted into studying gender inequality in sport.
Now, you've just mentioned that there is a common understanding that the way women are portrayed in media coverage, they are often misrepresented or represented in a certain way, but there's not so much research about why that actually is the case, right? And so you went about finding out or maybe get a glimpse of why that is in the Irish media landscape. Tell us a bit about what you've done.
So there's probably a couple of baseline figures that are interesting to think about. So there's a really interesting project that's done every 5 years called the Global Media Monitoring Project, where across numerous countries, people monitor for a day how much representation women get in media and where that representation shows up. And sport is kind of interesting in that because it's in the top 3 subjects in which women are least likely to appear. So that's quite a stark, we think so many people are involved in sport, so many women have sporting lives, and yet they're very much excluded from that field in terms of representation. Uh, while Cliona came to me early in maybe 2019, 2020, looking for baseline data, it's only in the last year that Ireland has now generated some of that data. So Sport Ireland, our national sporting organisation, has for the first time done a monitoring project. Their Women in Sport project has now found that women in Ireland, their sport gets about 18% of coverage. So that gives us a sense of the quantity of coverage going on, either through the Global Media Monitoring one, where they found about 14% of news subjects are women. The Irish project found women get about 18% of representation. So we're well under the 20%. And then, as you said, there's a lot of issues that come up with misrepresentation then. Like research has been done internationally, and it shows up a kind of a whole series of patterns where women are kind of marginalized, or they tend to be sexualized in how they're spoken about. They can be trivialized, stereotyped. And you'll often hear a discourse of, oh, but all that's changing. Now they have so much more coverage and we're really starting to pay attention and women's sport is taken seriously. And it is great. Like the recent Paris Olympics in 2024 was the first time there was gender parity in terms of participation, which is fantastic. However, it was also at that Paris Olympics that some of the broadcasters had to pull their camera operators aside and take them to task on how they were framing shots. So they were much more inclined to go in for the close-up shot on the women, and they were framing them and shooting them in ways that were quite different to how they were framing the men. And of course, many, many of the camera operators are men themselves. So there was a lot of visual gendering going on in that. And then there was also a controversy over a commentator who, when the Australian swimming team, I think, had won their gold medal and they were delayed for some reason. And then he said, oh, they're probably faffing around putting on their makeup. That kind of trivialization still goes on.
Just one comment about the Paris Olympics. We recently also had an example in the Winter Olympics, such and the figure skating, and a commentator making a very, very similar comment about a female figure skater. And I think that also goes to show that, those kind of ways of portraying women still persist today, even though some things might have changed. Let's get back to your report and maybe give us a brief summary of the reporting you've done on site in Ireland.
The particular report that you're talking about was done in collaboration with the Federation of Irish Sport, who and funded by Sport Ireland. So it had great buy-in from the sporting organisations in Ireland, who are really proactive and really great when it comes to media engagement and wanting to shift the dial there in terms of representation. They recognise that it's really important. So that was really great to have that support. Um, the research, kind of question, I suppose, that pinned it was, why are things the way they are? I was kind of curious. I'm very sympathetic to journalists and the jobs they do and how they do things. And I think it's really useful sometimes to have conversations with them that aren't so much about wagging fingers of, you're doing this wrong, but asking, like, why is it done this way? And what are the steps that get us to this kind of repeating pattern? And many of the journalists I engaged with were great and very thoughtful, very reflective, gave great insights, had thought about this issue quite a lot as well. But there were also quite a body of them who simply never replied to the invitation to participate in the research. And that tells us something as well. So that's kind of an interesting aside. So really, it was conversations with a lot of journalists across print, radio, television, online, asking them to tell me a bit about why they think the representation of women is the way it is. And they came up with kind of a patterned and logical explanation for it. And one of the things they would have said is, it's a legacy issue that, historically women didn't participate as much in sport. They didn't participate as much in media. Their voices weren't heard. A lot of the time their sports were underfunded. And so you would typically have women playing, in a stadium that wasn't as photogenic or as impressive as the male stadium. And so it wasn't as televisually pleasing to be trying to film them in those sort of situations. So they didn't garner the media attention that they should have. And that even when women were A, playing sport, and B, it was deemed newsworthy, C, the journalists would have argued the audience weren't that interested. That and there was a fundamental kind of sexism within Ireland that was, kind of dismissive of women's engagement in sport. So there was a lot of those factors going on around those kind of legacy issues. Um, and then in kind of a more contemporary moment, they said, look at journalism generally, our resources are shrinking. We only have a certain amount of space perhaps to fill, and that there's so many competing, very big dynamic sports like rugby, soccer, that compete for those that space already, that kind of pushes the women's sport out somewhat. Um, they would have also claimed there's a bit of a knowledge deficit, that they didn't always know as much about the women's teams or the history of the players as they would with the male equivalents. Um, so there was a lot of kind of reasons, and fairly rational reasons, that they gave as to why it was. And there were many of them who said, it shouldn't be like this, and were very much up for change in this area and could recognize the potential that perhaps there was a female audience there, and a growing female audience. But they just felt so constrained, I suppose, by commercial imperatives, that they were kind of risk averse in terms of just backing that outlet and looking at women's sport.
Reading the report and also some of the findings, I couldn't help thinking that they did seem a bit contradictory. So, to some extent, they said there was a knowledge and audience gap. But then, obviously, if you don't increase women's coverage, people might not know as much about it, about a certain football or rugby player, or the audience might grow if there was more coverage around it. Did you talk to them about those kind of aspects, or maybe how to increase knowledge and audiences across the coverage?
Yeah, the knowledge deficit wasn't seen as a huge barrier. Like, the Irish women's soccer team was doing quite well at the time, and they were able to get up to speed very quickly there. And what they found was, the televising, say, women's sport just doesn't just bring in a female audience. It also holds on to a male audience who will watch any kind of sport. So that was kind of an interesting finding for them. I had a really interesting conversation with one journalist who was, thinking aloud about this dynamic. As you said, we should grow the women's audience, but we're afraid to invest. And then he kind of said, but hang on a minute, we actually cover an awful lot of horse racing. and yet it doesn't garner huge audiences. So they were very inclined to kind of equate the audience at a sporting event, at a big match, with a potential readership or a potential viewership. And so, big rugby matches that would fill stadia were seen as, oh, we must cover these. Women's matches that might not fill stadia were, well, maybe we should cover them. And they would cover some of them. And they had dedicated resources, particularly to the Australian Women's World Cup, and sent journalists there to cover that. But there was still this reticence. And it was really interesting, that kind of dynamic between horse racing, which, people don't attend in huge numbers. It's fairly, so in some ways, maybe a bit specialist, that people don't follow it in such detail. So now every weekend I look at the sports supplement in one of our broadsheets, and I have a little competition to see, will there be more horses or women photographed in the
And
supplement.
what's the observation for now?
Usually the horses win. Yeah.
That also leads me to one other aspect that I found very interesting, is that aspect of women need to be successful and perform very well for them to be covered. But then at the same time, that means, they need to perform in order to be deemed sort of worth reporting on.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's certain sports, like individualistic sports, something like ice skating, as you were talking about earlier. It's very visual, very aesthetic, quite an individual women's sport that tends to get more coverage. So ice skating, gymnastics, those kinds of maybe minority sports, when they involve women, get more coverage than the big team games. The rugby, we'd have camogie here in Ireland, the women's game, and soccer. So those teams are under huge pressure to perform, in order to hold their fan base, but also the media interest in them.
Mm,
And if their skill wanes or their fate wanes, then that becomes a bit tricky for them.
mhm. I wonder, did you talk with these journalists about how they selected the topics? So was there like an editor in chief or someone that gave them a story, or were they like themselves able to pick and sort whatever they thought was viewable or attractive for their audiences?
Suppose that comes back a little bit to kind of the norms of journalism and those kind of organizational practices. There are certain things that must be covered, in terms of the men's team games, and the schedule of those dictates an awful lot. And in Ireland, we would look a lot to the UK, and the coverage of British soccer games would be huge in Ireland as well and get a lot of attention. So there were certain things in the editorial decisions that were just kind of almost non-negotiable. And then after that, I think, to be very fair to the journalists, there has been a shift that they would now also look to see, well, what's going on with the women's game. And to go back to Clean O'Leary and RTE, like, she did huge work to ensure that if the women's matches were on, that they would be televised. And that does have kind of organizational permutations. And you're going back to the sports bodies to say, look, can you run this match at a time which will work for the TV schedule? There's a whole kind of web of infrastructure that sits under what shows up in media and when it shows up and how it shows up. And it has taken, there has been a bit of a shift on the dial. But it has taken huge energy and resources, and kind of nearly an explicit program, the 20 by 20 program, that will, aimed to increase women's representation by 20% before 2020. It was a very kind of overt campaign, and a lot of journalists, a lot of media producers got on board with that and really tried to address the inclusion of women in their content. And it did start to move the dial. And I'd say it's kind of partly down to that we now have, they didn't quite hit the 20% increase, but that we have now nearly 18% coverage for women in sports nationally.
18%, obviously, you have to put these numbers into context. Like
Right.
18%, is that a shift up from, I don't know how much? Obviously, it's a number that seems very small still, but I guess it has gone up to some extent.
Hmm. It has, and it's part of the story as well, that these things haven't really been measured very systematically anywhere. So there's a few figures that float around. There's a UNESCO figure from 2018 that says the coverage was 4%. Then we have the Global Media Monitoring Project that said women appear as 14% of the subjects in news, on sports news. And now we have the Irish data that says women got 18% coverage. So there's a lot of apples, oranges, pears going on when you get into this quantitative data. It's a very big undertaking to actually kind of monitor media in a very coherent way, systematically and repeatedly in order to track the numbers. But that's why I think Sports Ireland have invested now, their Women in Sport programme has invested in that effort, so that there is a baseline number and that like can be compared with like over time to see what way the shifts happen.
I guess I just, just came to me as you talked about how it matters if media broadcasts, sports events. And I do think the UK, for instance, is a good example of how they, broadcast women's football. So I do think they give a lot of airtime to their very successful female team, which I think is great. But then again, attached to success and maybe certain expectations.
Yeah.
I wonder, as you talked about the efforts in Ireland, do you know what happened with that report? Do you think, was it, transferred or conveyed to the sports industry, to journalists? What was the reception? Guide us through sort of the after effects of that report.
It was presented a couple of times to journalists who had either participated in the research, informed it or not, a broader kind of pool of them. And I mean, they were very gracious in the reception of it and kind of keen to think, well, what next and what would need to happen next and how do we go about making change? But it is a very big project and it does require resourcing. And I do think it's important, say, for some of the sporting bodies to not just put the efforts into the monitoring, but also to keep their pressure on around the change agenda, because it constantly has to be driven, it constantly has to be spoken about, engaged with. There needs to be a strategy there. And I suppose that's another one of the key findings from the research is there weren't very many explicit strategies within any of the media organizations around what were they aiming to increase? How much could they increase this? How would they go about doing it? What would they do specifically? It was very much left up to kind of individual key players to say, well, I'm going to make sure if the men's team get this, then the women's team get exactly the same treatment. Or I'm going to make sure I have these women's sports people on my podcast, or I'm going to make sure I represent women's voices as much as men. So it was really down to a lot of the individual journalists to kind of carry the torch for that, or individual outlets to do it. There wasn't either within media organizations strategy and policy and objectives, nor was there across the sector. And I think there's probably a piece of work there, certainly for our regulator in Ireland, Comisiún na Meán, to take on that as well around gender equality, particularly around sports.
There has been some research on how, women report differently on women in sport. But as your report says, that's not going to be the ultimate solution, bringing in more people and more women to report on sports.
I think it's important to also bring in more women. And I think where we bring the women in and how we bring them in is really, really important. And sometimes in the representation of sport, it can look on screen like there are a lot of women in sport because there's a lot of them in presenting roles or in reporting roles. And so they're on camera, they're very visual. But if you look behind the scenes, sometimes the entire department that they're coming out can be very male dominated, with only a small minority of women journalists working there. But they're on screen, so it doesn't look like there's a huge gender misrepresentation. So I think it's really important to bring women into the journalistic roles, but also into the leadership roles, into the decision-making roles, giving them editorial power, but also not giving them a poison chalice of like, here's a really tricky problem and now you need to go and figure it out and you can be the woman in leadership who's doing this and be very exposed. I do think it's up to some of the men currently in leadership positions for, to accept that this is not good enough. It's nowhere near parity. It's unjust fundamentally and sexist and needs to be addressed. And so I think there's a huge piece of work there for our media leaders to do around that, particularly those working in public service where they claim to be representing the views of a very broad public. I think the other place that women need to appear more in sports is as expert voices. We have brilliant women's sports stars who, when they retire, can make fantastic commentators. And I think we need their expertise, their voices, and not just on the women's games, but also on the men's games. And And that's beginning to happen, but I think we need to make sure that, as pundits, as experts, as commentators, we have more women so that their voices are heard and their opinions are valued rather than dismissed, and working across both women and men's sports in that regard.
At the beginning, we talked about your previous work or continuous work around the media industry. So I'm just wondering, as you mentioned all these things, I can't help thinking that there are some, connections and maybe things that you find are very similar among these industries. Is that the case?
Very much so. Yeah, the women who worked in film and television, like they would have described some of the, structural, the certain presumption that, if you're a woman, you're going to go work in production rather than in technical roles. And I think something similar goes on, say, in sports departments. More recently, I've been looking a lot at mothers who work in media industries and just how that brings a whole other level of not just kind of pressure in terms of the care work they're doing as well as the formal work, but also kind of an explicit bias that comes, that, well, if you're a mother, you mustn't be that dedicated to your job anymore. You might not be as available. And it can really lead to some bias and further discriminations there.
Mm.
Still a lot of work to do to look at those kind of intersecting, and women from, say, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. How do they fare in these spheres as well? So there's still a lot of inequalities and underrepresentations that can be examined further through research in this area.
One thing I wanted to ask you was the concept of, being framed as a mother, because I also thought that was quite interesting that women are sometimes, there's a shift in narrative. Sometimes they're being sexualized, but then, sometimes they're being referred to as a partner, a wife, or even as a mother. I find that interesting because to some extent, I do think there's value in pointing out that, a female athlete who is a mother, that for me is an even more powerful achievement, like someone
Mhm.
having a major comeback, after giving birth, a high performer. So I do think there's merit in calling that person a mother and pointing out to, what that person has accomplished with their body. And at the same time, we are framing that athlete as a mother and sort of, boxing them in a certain way. I just thought that was kind of an interesting, yeah, discussion to have.
Mm. Yeah, I've all sorts of ambivalences around it as well, in exactly the way you're describing. On the one hand, I think we need to acknowledge women's bodies are women's bodies. They work somehow differently to men's, and in terms of training and how that's managed, there probably needs to be a lot more discussion of that and very overt, and even later on, menopausal women and how that works in terms of physical fitness, and that's conversation is starting as well. Um, in terms of the motherhood piece, it's really interesting, and the parallels go back to film as well. Like just recently, our own Jessie Buckley won the Best Actress Oscar and was very overt about her status as a mother. And that's quite, it doesn't appear a very radical claim, but actually is, because a lot of film actresses will either not refer to having children um, or not want to be cast as mothers in productions because it ages them, and Hollywood fetishizes youth and youthfulness and all the rest of it. So it's been a real problem. And that then maps back into the women working in film industries as well, where, I've had interviewed women who had worked together for a number of years and neither one had disclosed to the other that they had children. So they were literally hiding fact. There was, camera people hiding pregnancies. There was all kinds of things going on around this, very natural part for many women of their evolution of their lives, and something that should be integrated into their sport life or into their film work, but which is actually very difficult to do that on the ground. So it was very interesting to see how overtly Jessie Buckley was claiming that space. Now she can, she's the Oscar winning, she's got a lot of power. It'll be interesting to see can women on crew claim that maternal status as well, and some of the flexibilities that might be needed around it. Is the film industry really willing to change how it does business to accommodate the integration of mothers more into the workforce? And a similar thing with sport. It is that ambivalence, isn't it, between yes, I've done all this and here I am with, a very small baby as well, versus, will men be judged by that or will that be part of it? So I guess it's where it's coming from and who's generating it. If it's the women themselves foregrounding it, I don't really have any issue. Whereas if it's something they're being asked about, then maybe it's something to be a little bit mindful of.
I have one final question for you. If you had, infinite possibilities, and let's maybe focus on sports or some of the things you've done previously, what kind of research would you love to do if you had all the resources in the world?
I think a really interesting piece of work to do would be to set up maybe some sort of a quota system where women just had to have equal representation across all of our media. And to actually set that, it's really interesting that journalists challenge themselves always to get the person closest to the story. If you win the gold medal tomorrow and I win the silver medal, they're not really interested in talking to me. They want you and they will find you and they will stay going till they get you. But the same level of determination isn't set when it comes to kind of how much coverage of women could we have. So if I could be dictator for a day, I'd be very benign. I think it would be so interesting to set that target and say, right, it's 50-50. You just have to stay doing your job until half of our content is about women, featuring women, with women experts, with women working on in production, and to see what that looks like and see what the actual challenges are. So if the mindset was to really change, would some of the barriers fall away? Or would there be other kind of issues there that would be problematic? So that'd be a really interesting kind of virtual reality type piece of research to do.
Thanks so much for taking the time, Anne, and for having this very, very insightful conversation with us.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
And that's it for today. See you soon!